Welcome back. In this video, we'll add a button to our deck component. When you click it, we'll send a new request using the deck ID we just saved in the last video, and then when it comes back, we'll display an image. So let's add a nice button at the bottom, and it's not going to be a nice button, it's going to be very ugly, but we'll style it later. So get card, and the first thing we need to do is add some sort of on click. And what should we call it? Let's say this.getCard. So we need to define a method called getCard. In addition, before I forget, I'm going to bind it in the constructor. This.getCard equals this.getCard.bind this. All right, so what do we need to do instead of getCard? We'll need to make request using deck ID, mail request. Oof, that sounds like a classified ad. Anyway, make request, and then after that, we're going to need to set state using new card info from API. So for making a request, that means we need to do an axios.get, but what's the URL for this? If we go back to the instructions here, this is the URL. Come back, right there. But of course, we're going to replace this with our actual deck ID. The problem, well, it's not really a problem, but we have some duplication because if we're going to make this its own variable and have this be its own variable called API URL, it's just unnecessary duplication. So instead of doing const card API URL and then putting that up top, what I'm going to do is refactor this. And I'll call this part API base URL because what they share in common is all the way up until deck/. So I'm going to get rid of this at the end, keep the base URL as it is, and then come back to our original component mount. And instead of requesting API URL, we're going to request a new string, which is going to be API base URL, and then afterwards /new/shuffle. And we need to make sure I close that correctly. Okay, so that should make our request. And if I comment all of this out, let's make sure that we're still getting that in the state, getting the deck ID. So it's still working. That's good. Next, this API URL is going to be our base URL up until here /deckid/draw. So let's make a new variable called card URL like that. And it will be equal to our base card URL, so our base API. And then /, and then we're going to add another variable in, which will be our deck ID. Now our deck ID is stored in this.state.deck.deck_ID. So here's deck in the state, deck_ID, like that. I'm going to make another variable for it called ID equals this.state.deck.deckID. All right, then we're going to add that in, and then we'll finish with /draw. And if we didn't have any typos, that should be our URL to request a new card. Then we're going to use Axios again, axios.get card URL, and we'll save that response to a variable. And I'm going to make this an async function once again. And we'll call this variable card response, card res, equals await the result of axios.get. And we can begin by just console.logging card res. Let's see if it works. All right, so I'm going to click here and let's see what we get. Unfortunately, we're getting an error here, and I spent a little bit of time debugging this, and it's a really annoying problem. I need a / at the end. That's what the API wants. Now, if we click, we're actually getting the response. So the reason we're seeing this whole object printed out instead of just the data is that we're printing out the entire object right here. So let's now only print out the data. So now I click, we send a request using that deck ID, and we get an array of cards coming back where we have, let's see, one card. That's all we asked for. We have the 7 of clubs, and here is our image URL. All right, so next let's figure out where we're going to actually store that information in the state. So if we come back up here, I'm going to make an array called drawn, or drawn cards. Drawn is fine. And every time we are requesting a new card, I'm going to add its information into drawn. So the data that came back, let's capture the card information. So we'll make a variable called card equal to card response dot data dot cards 0. Remember, there's only one thing in there, but it is in an array, as we saw. We need to make sure that we're getting cards 0. Okay, so that gives us the card. Now we're going to need to set state to update the drawn array. So this dot set state, and I'm going to use the callback version this time. So I'll call my old state st, and then in here we're going to set drawn to be a new array that contains everything from the old array. So I'm going to do state.drawn. So this will give us all the existing data. So the first time through, this will be empty here. And then we're going to also add in a new object where we have an ID. And I think what makes most sense is for the ID to be the card code right here, 7S. Those are unique. So we'll do ID is card.code. And then let's also include the image, which is card.image, if I'm not mistaken. Yep, card.image. And then I also added in a property called name, which I'll use for an alt attribute down the line. It's just the suit with a space and then the value. So let's see if this is working right now. If I click on get card, all right, it looks like it worked. But let's go to our React tools and see what's inside of our state. Inside of drawn, we have one item, and it was the 3 of spades. So we have this name, spades 3. I actually might switch that around and do the opposite order, like this. So it says spades, and let's do of in the middle. So one more time, let's look at our dev tools, click the button, and now we have one array, or one item, 3 of hearts. Let's try getting another card. All right, and each time we are adding more to our state. So we're almost done. There's, aside from displaying stuff, but there's one problem, which is right now, if I keep clicking, eventually we're going to run out of cards. Okay, so I kept clicking and we get an error. What's happening is that we didn't actually get a response with a new card because we exhausted the deck. So it can't read this property of card.code because there is no card. So we need to make sure we're accounting for that. And what I'm going to do is inside of my get card, I'm going to wrap things with a try block. So I'm going to do try, curly braces, and then the stuff that I want to try is this card URL plus making the request. And I'm going to check what our response looks like, because if we're out of cards, there's a property called remaining in our response. If it's set to 0, we'll throw an error. So if card response dot data dot remaining equals 0, then I'm going to throw a new error, no cards left or something, no cards remaining. And I'll move all of this code up into our try block. And then at the very end, I'm going to catch any errors. And for now, we'll just alert the error. So if I come back, I click a bunch of times, we should see that eventually, I'll fast forward through this, but we're still requesting and getting the data we want. But then once we hit that 50-second and every time afterwards, I should get an alert soon. Come on, there we go. No cards remaining, and we didn't get an error for trying to insert something into here that we weren't able to insert. There is one small detail that is problematic. We're actually only getting 51 cards because the last time we request a card, it brings the card back and then it sets remaining to be 0. So we're actually ignoring that card. Okay, so I commented out our code that's supposed to catch the error, or not catch it, but is supposed to throw the error if there are no remaining cards. And I sent a bunch of requests. Here are the last 2. So this is the last card we want to include. There's still a card here, and it just says that there are 0 remaining going forward. The deck is empty, but here is the last card. So when we're checking if remaining is 0, we are throwing this card away. The next time through, remaining is 0, and there's no cards. So what we could do, instead of checking remaining, we could check if cards is empty. That's one option. Cards.length equals 0. We could also check success. And that actually might be a better way of doing it, because potentially we could be requesting an invalid deck ID, and we would get success set to false. So there's more than one reason our request could fail. It's almost always going to be because our cards are empty. There's no more remaining cards, but it's possible there's another reason. So I'm going to switch this to be if card.data.success, and then I'm going to negate it. Logical not. So if not card response.data.success, we'll throw the error. Now let's see if it works. I'm going to click a bunch of times. Okay, so we got the last card here, and then one more time, and we get that error, the alert popping up, but our code isn't breaking. And if we look at our React Dev Tools, we should see that drawn is now 52 cards long. Whew, all right, a little bit of trouble in this video, but got it to work. Now, next video, we're gonna focus on displaying some cards, making the card component.